Neighbor. Bob and Noni were great neighbors. They were fun, giving, helpful, nice, loving, gracious, everything that this world needs more of. If there's one recommendation I can make to all of you, find yourself a Bob and Noni. And if you can't find a Bob and Noni, be the Bob and Noni. This world would be a nicer place if we all did that. Now, Bob and I talked a lot. Okay, maybe he talked more than I did, and I listened. Not to say that he didn't listen to me, but he had so many more stories, so many more great stories. They were so entertaining, I just took it all in and loved every bit of it. Some of his favorite stories and thoughts were about his family. He was so very proud of each and every one of you. Phil, Carolyn, David, Dan, Chris. His chest puffed up a bit every time he talked about you. You each were unique and special, and I can tell he each loved you so much. He talked about you so often. And he loved his grandkids so much, Caitlin, Leah, Audrey, Alex, and Robert. He loved you guys so much, talked about you all the time. And of course, Noni. He never said a negative word about you and respected everything about you and everything he said to me. We could all tell how much he loved you by the way you two were together. Working in the yard, being part of the neighborhood, having your ice cream on the porch in the summer. The only thing that he ever worried about was getting in trouble when he and I started talking about taking down trees. He'd say, we better run this by Cindy and Noni before we get started. And of course I said, nah, they'll just want us to hire somebody. No, we're not gonna do that. The tree projects. Well, we must have taken down at least 10 to 12 trees in our backyards, and not just any trees, 50 to 60-year-old oaks, a couple feet in diameter, 60 feet high, huge trees, kind of like a Tim Allen tree. But Bob loved the chainsaw. He could smell me gassing one up a mile away. If I was trying to start one, he'd be right over. Hey, Matt, what you got going on? Cutting some trees today? It makes me smile so much to think of him in those trees. But that's how he was. If I was mowing the lawn, he'd be over to talk about the grass and how much better ours looked than the guys on the other side of the street. Actually, that's a lie. We talked about how much theirs looked better than ours. Thanks, Ken. If I was cleaning gutters, he'd be over. We'd put underground sprinklers in together, we blew leaves together. If I had an engine and made some noise, he was there. Shoot, if we had a car full of boxes, he'd be over there to help us carry them in. That's the guy Bob was. In the wintertime, he'd snow blow a path between our doors so we could be easier to get back and forth. In fact, he was my driveway snow blow guy for the last 15 years. I never had to worry about that being done. He was up first thing in the morning clearing driveways. He actually had to tone it down a bit because the other neighbors had blowers and they wanted to do their own driveway. Again, find yourself a Bob and Noni. One funny story I will share. We were surgically removing one of the trees out of the backyard. We trimmed all the branches. I was going up the ladder to top it off. We had about a 28-foot extension ladder, about another 10 feet on top of that. I'd climbed so high, I swear I could saw Lake Michigan. Bob's down on the ground, trying the rope around his waist, pulling on the rope so that it lands in the right way. I'm thinking, oh boy, nothing can go wrong here. The wind is blowing, I'm swaying back and forth. Bob's on the ground and going, all right, let's go. Well, I cut the tree, the top falls over. Kind of make sure everything's good. I turn around and there's no Bob. Where did he go? Thinking, did he go inside? What happened? Did anything happen? Well, he tied the rope, he backpedaled so hard, he went over a stack of branches and disappeared behind the branch. I went to look at him, there he was with his feet up in the air. Now keep in mind, this is a guy 70 years old with 2 replaced hips. He got up, dusted himself off, and said, that was great. We laughed about a lot of things. Well, we laughed about that one for a lot of years, but we laughed about a lot of things, and we laughed about a lot of you. Now, many or most of you may not know me, but I sure know all of you. I spent many nights at the house listening to the stories and reminiscing. His mind was incredibly sharp library of people in his life. His recall was amazing. Friends, players, coaches, schoolmates. He literally remembered all of you. He has told me a story of something about each and every one of you at some point in our time together. Don't worry, they were all good stories. He spoke very nicely of all of you. Seriously, anything he said about anyone had a very positive look to it. He was amazing. It showed what a positive person he was and what a positive outlook he had on life. Now, don't get me wrong, we still talked football, and as you know, it was his love and his passion. But it was all of you that he enjoyed so much. All of the events in his life were shared by you at some point. It makes me smile so much to think of how much he loved the people in his life. Whether it was a kind word or a supportive message or a hard teaching point, it all had a great impact on all of us. And he did it with the greatest intention in mind, to make us better people. The biggest thing that comes to mind when I think of Bob is his legacy. We all think about the legacy that he left behind. Kindness, support, toughness, compassion, fundamentals, keys for you football guys, hard work, team, and family. I hope someday that I can leave behind a legacy that somehow comes close to that. I sure hope so. I hope we all can. Bob's legacy is amazing. And now, hopefully, we can bring some of that to our world. With all the craziness of the last couple of years, I can't think of a better honor than to bring some of his traits and to pay it forward. I have a favorite reading that I always like to give to people in my life that have such a profound impact. The majority of us lead quiet, unheralded lives as we pass through this world. There will most likely be no ticker tape parades for us, no moments created in our honor, but that does not lessen our possible impact, for there are scores of people waiting for someone just like us to come along, people who appreciate our compassion, our unique talents, someone who live a happier life merely because we took the time to share what we had to give. Too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, or the smallest act of caring, all which have a potential to turn a life around. It's overwhelming to consider the continuous opportunities there are to make our love felt. Those are the words I think Bob lived by. And so my time up here should be done, and I've got so many other great stories that I wish I could share, but I'll end it by this. Part of our night's talking and sharing might have involved a little bit of the distilled spirits. Cindy and I would go over, or I would go over, and Bob would offer me a drink, and Noni would pop us some popcorn. We'd talk and sip and eat and corn and talk some more until it would get very late. The girls bailed hours ago, and we'd lose track of time. One time it went so long, I could barely make it home. I live next door. As I was heading out the door, Bob said, "Hey, you want..."
Good morning. I've gone through 3 notebooks of what to write and say about my friend Bob Knight. So actually, I'm not going to follow a script. I'm going to shoot from the hip. 1971, the spring. Bob Knight was assigned, contracted to be the head football coach at Portage Central High School. Bob and I were adversaries. Actually, we didn't get along very well. Bob was the assistant football coach at Muskegon High School, a very, very, very successful program, probably has more wins than any other school in the state of Michigan. I was the assistant football coach at Muskegon Catholic Central, which was also a very successful football program. In fact, on game days, Bob and I would kind of leer at each other. Unfortunately, for Muskegon Catholic, the time that I was there, Bob dominated. Very good games, very well coached, as you would expect a Bob Knight team that he was associated with. We had the LMAC spring meeting, and it was late April, early May, and I swallowed my pride and went up to the guy from Muskegon and said, "Bob, congratulations." What for? I said, "Well, you're going to Portage Central High School." He said, "Yes, I am. Thank you, Frank." And he said, "I'd like you to come with me as my assistant." Needless to say, I was stunned. And it was, I accepted a day later. I had to bounce it off my wife, and the whole family was excited to go. And a week or so later, we went to the night house for dinner, and the kids, Philip, Christy, Carolyn, Tracy, Amy, David, Christy, and Danny weren't thought of yet. And the kids were climbing the trees, the wives were getting to know each other, and Bob and I were watching film. We looked at the film, and Bob thought, and that's why he took the job, that he could make a difference at Portage Central and turn that program into a successful program. So anyway, he came to Portage. I was out in Seattle, Washington, Tacoma for the whole summer, so I could not be part of the participation of getting ready. But Bob got the coaching staff together. He sent letters out to the players, great expectations. Before the season actually started, he met with the parents at the cafeteria, told what his expectations were, and we went and we had a 2-7 season the first year. Bob was not used to losing. And after the games, especially close games, there'd be a crowd of people that would clap when we would come out. And Bob said, kind of different, isn't it, Frank? That they're clapping for you when you lose? Well, anyway, Bob believed and he had firm convictions that he could make a difference. And he did. He was. The next season, we were 7-2 and conference champions. And everybody's going, Bob Knight's got it. The program has turned around. Portage Central was the doormat of the league. I don't believe they had won a game the year before or maybe one before that. And so things were on the roll. Not true. Not true at all. With the success we had, for some reason, other players to come into the program couldn't buy into the Bob Knight philosophy. Bob instilled that in all of his coaches, middle school through high school, on what and how he wanted to do it. And Bob was pretty firm as to how he wanted to do it. He did it this way, and it wasn't going to be that way. So anyway, during that time that we started slipping, so to speak, people weren't very kind, especially when we got to the point where we were 1-8 and 1-8. People wanted Bob's head. I think it's important for you to know the hurdles that Bob overcame in getting this program to the level at which it came until the time that he retired, and that it is continuing to grow the same way. Coaches kind of like to be around Bob. Bob's got coaches in the program that are still there that have been started with Bob, and they're in their 39th year. Most of the coaches were with him for 20 years or more. One thing Bob did, he was a visionary. He recognized that the Portage Central kids were not the kids that he could run the old belly that we used to run at Muskegon and just hammer people. Our kids were small. We didn't have the talent that other schools had. So he brought in a retired coach from Western Michigan, and said, I need to change the offense. The year we won the conference championship, we had team leadership. We had captains that led the kids. Kids worked after practice, stayed after, ran sprints after, and so on and so forth. The 1-8 team had some really good leadership. They carried through the next year with some leadership, and we went from 1-8 to 6-3. Well, by that time, let me go back a bit. We got letters of people that wanted Bob fired. We got letters that there were no signatures on them that had SOB. And Bob thought that was endearing. He said, "Oh, they think I'm sweet old Bob." But I had to leave the program for a couple years because I went into administration, and Bob and I talked a lot, especially during the 1 and 8 years. And I'll tell you one thing, Bob worked probably harder those 2 years than he did at any other year, the other 2 years during the course of his career at coaching, being the head coach at Portage Central High School. The coaches loved working with Bob. The kids adored Bob. Some kids, you know, Bob would bark once in a while if things weren't being done a certain way, you know. But Bob always had confidence in the kids that some of them could bounce back and say, "I'll show you, Coach," and others couldn't take it so well. And those others that couldn't take it so well, it was the assistant coach's responsibility when Bob knocked them down a little bit for you to pump them up, because we have to have them to play. And that worked very well. Bob was very organized. Practice, we had a practice schedule for every day. We had a game plan, and we had coaches that would mention that they thought we ought to do this, do that during the day. Bob listened. And occasionally Bob would say, "Okay," but more often than not, he said, "This is the way it's going to be." But we did have input and great camaraderie, and as time went on, the community bought into the program. Bob did some brilliant things. In fact, the first thing I didn't know Bob's name was Robert until we were at Noni's, and we had Robert. Well, at that point, I knew who was in charge. Yeah. I never well, actually, I'll tell you, his ed class was doing the dance unit. And I would go by the gym, sneak in the backside, and just stand there and laugh at sweet old Bob teaching a hustle. And he was teaching the hustle the way you were supposed to do it. And you were graded on it, and if you didn't do it the right way, you didn't pass. But there was also a lady that made sure Bob did it the right way, and that was the phys ed teacher that was there when we came on board. You know, I haven't mentioned the names of any of the assistant coaches because there are so many of them. There was a handful that went on to other jobs, very successful. A couple of them took teams to state championships. Others moved to different parts. But most often, they hung with Bob. Bob was inducted into the Hall of Fame, Michigan High School Football Coaches Association Hall of Fame. Bob saw that his assistants were, as many as possible, were inducted as well. Bob was loyal to his staff. His staff was loyal to Bob. Bob was have his door closed, and there'd be some young lady or some young man in there that was having trouble at home, in school, and he would counsel them. Bob made an impact on not hundreds, but thousands of kids' lives. The kids that he had in gym class, the kids on the football team, and the people in his church. I think really that he met with Pastor on Sundays before we had our Sunday night meeting, because of a lot of the things that Pastor talked about were what Bob brought to our Sunday night meetings. But you couldn't find a harder working person. Bob's memory was unbelievable. He would know virtually every one of you young men that are here that played for him. He had his mind at practice was like a 16-millimeter camera. He saw the whole picture. He could tell you what the tell me what the defensive backs were doing wrong. He could tell the other coaches what their position players were doing wrong. He saw the whole thing. And game time, win or lose. Kids would take a knee in the locker room at first, and he would address the group, and he would say, "We did a great job, and now we got to get ready to go again. So-and-so, you were good, you did this, you did that." And then on losses, he would take it upon his own shoulders to say, "I didn't do a good job of preparing you." That's the only time I'd ever hear him say "I." He said, "But we will do a better job to get you ready for next week." And he worked hard. We charted everything. I know I'm going long, but you need to know this because it always wasn't roses, carnations for Bob, but people believed in him. The community got on board, and he was very, very successful. And when I came back to the program, I finally got the administration to allow me to come back to the program, and I'll close with this, was that I said, "Bob, can you take me back into the program?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I got the release to come and work with you or not." And I said, "But it's a non-paid position, volunteer position." He said, "Yeah, we got a spot for you." And he said, "Just a minute." And Bob went into the storage room and came out with a sock. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "This sock," he says, "I'm paying you. This sock is your first installment. If we have a good season, you get the second sock." Well, in the next 28 years, I believe it was, I got 26 pairs of socks. So it was a pleasure and a privilege to work with Bob as a coach, as a teacher, talk about our families, his God, and I'll miss my friend, but he will not be forgotten. I'm going to ask you to do one thing for me, and when kids did something particularly good, Bob would go, "One big hand for Bob." So I'm going to ask you to say, when I say "one good hand for Bob," I want you to clap once. Let's have one big hand for my friend Bob. Great, thank you. And last but not least, because I avoided mentioning coaches' names because I would forget them, all those who participated in the program as coaches, statisticians, spotters in the press box, any other capacity, would you please stand up? These kind of were Bob's kids, and they believed in Bob, and the rest is history. Sorry I went so long, but thank you.
I first met Bob back in the late 80s. We were both members here at St. Michael's, and I was coaching football at the time. So after the service every Sunday, Bob, Denny Patzer, who was another very successful coach, and I would talk football. And that usually needed extended time, so we'd usually end up going to breakfast, and that would usually last till about noon or 1 o'clock. Noni, you can remember those times. But this went on for several years, and it was during that time that I got to know Bob and really realized his passion for coaching. It wasn't necessarily about the winning for Bob, although like any coach, Bob liked to win. He was good at it, as Frank said. But what brought him the most gratification was taking a group of players and getting them to come together and work toward a common goal. He wanted every player to have a positive experience in his program as they grew as young men. I remember his teams were characterized as being physical, unselfish, hardworking, and disciplined. Bob expected that. Bob demanded that. Bob wanted his players to respect and develop relationships with each other and their coaches. The focus was never on him. It was all about his team and coaching staff. And when people would ask him about his coaching prowess or a great win or a strategy or a great play call, Bob would always credit his players and coaches. He would never take the credit himself. Coaches are always looking for an edge to be successful. Some are successful for varying periods of time, but the true greatest coaches are those that have lasting success, that establish a program. That was Bob. He created such a program at Portage Central. His 34-year tenure is a testimony to that. All those conference championships, they made the playoffs several times, runner-up in the state in 1977. He knew the formula for success. He believed in his players, and they believed in him. He created a winning attitude that permeated throughout the program. His players knew that the team was more important than any individual on the team. That contributed to a culture of success and a career that most coaches can only dream about. Here at St. Michael's, Bob was very involved. He was a lay minister, a greeter, a lector, an usher, VBS volunteer, helped count the offering, belonged to a small Bible study group, was always available to lend a hand to deliver Meals on Wheels or help with world relief. He was involved with Youth for Christ and performed many other duties as well. But more importantly, in this congregation, Bob was a great example, a true friend, and a brother to many. Bob's middle name was Paul, and this fact brings to mind another individual with the first name of Paul, namely the Apostle Paul. It seems these two had more in common than just a name. Both individuals had people who worked with them that were extremely loyal to them. Paul had Barnabas and others. Bob had several of the assistant coaches that Frank's already alluded to who stayed with him for years. Today, these examples of loyalty are rare in the coaching profession and in our society in general. This speaks to the character and leadership qualities of both men. Both were amazing mentors. Paul had several people that he mentored and impacted. Bob mentored coaches, colleagues, students, and athletes his entire life. He would always take the time to get involved. This speaks to the wisdom and caring nature of both men. Both took risks in educating groups of people, not knowing the response or outcome. Paul did this throughout his ministry, and Bob in particular did this with a football class that he taught to the players' mothers. I can't imagine what some of those conversations were like. Former players would stop by and visit with Bob when they were in town. Both men left lasting impacts that are still evident today. Paul's in the church, Bob's in this community and beyond. Both men have left amazing legacies. Pastor read this earlier. Paul wrote in his last days, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." Robert Paul Knight fought the good fight, finished the race, he kept the faith. On earth, Bob was a Hall of Famer. Bob knew Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, and now he's in God's Hall of Fame.
So that group just set a pretty high standard. Good afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dan Knight. I'm Coach Bob Knight's fourth son. As I was presented with given probably the toughest speech, I thought of three things that my dad would say. And believe it or not, he said it more than once. Be simple and short, speak your heart, and don't blubber up there. All right, so I think our previous have done it pretty well, at least 2 out of 3. So I'll try to do 2 out of 3. I'm not sure which one. All right, and I offer this, and I really appreciate the humor that's been today. I think my dad tried to lighten life. I think there's a lot of talk about his one-liners. Even as he faced some of the toughest things in his life, when he got his CAT scan back, his comments to me were, well, I got the results back. There's going to be some people that are surprised. What's that, Dad? He goes, well, they found brains. He said, and they found some other stuff too. And I think as we stepped through this, he kept the same attitude and humor, and that we were able to kid with him. And I think his moments during that time when we could kid with him and laugh in a very serious situation were really what carried him over. So first of all, I'd like to say thanks to everyone that's here. This is remarkably special to our family, considering the event. I'd also like to thank everyone that's supported us over the years, our family, on behalf of my mom, Noni, and my brothers and sisters and our extended family. The outpouring of stories and support is overwhelming. It's just been unbelievable. And it was a tribute to someone who's been sated, cared so deeply. I would like to point out that I did haul out my dad's yellow legal pad to get this done. All right, so as I start today, I'm going to leave you with a Bible verse, and it'll shape a little bit about what I said, and it comes from Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so does one person sharpen another. My dad loved his God. He was a man of faith. He believed in the principles of the Lutheran Church and what that represented from the big picture. His faith was ever present. It did not matter if we were almost dead. We were going to be in the back of the church, and we could run to the bathroom and vomit if we needed to. And that was something that was very important. That may have come from my mom as well, I'm just saying. But I think as you think about that verse, that represents how he practiced his faith. And I think when you think of iron and you think of sharpening, there's two sides. He loved his family. He loved my mom. He loved all his children. He loved his grandchildren. He loved, brothers and sisters. His brothers were super important to him. I know this will be shocking to you, but they may have gotten in a couple fights when they were growing up. But I think as Mr. Orkowski talked about, just because you got in a fight with him, it didn't mean you were forever in hatred. So he still had the ability to come back and like people, except if they were on the other team. I think it was interesting, when we talk about the different standards, there's certain things, and I've talked to folks, and, my dad would say stuff like when we'd get a little bit lippy with my mom, don't you ever talk to my wife like that again. And I think that set kind of the standard as we were a family. He was a disciplinarian growing up, moderately. But I think what's really interesting is he evolved. It's funny because you read the stories, and if you haven't, I'd really encourage you to, because I think everybody had a sphere of what they knew of my dad. And they're very different. Like when the neighbor, Brenda, yeah, your dad's a hugger. Has he always been that way? I was like, no. No, he was not. But I think as life went along, and we talk about iron sharpening iron, the experiences that he dealt with as we got older, he really evolved from that disciplinarian to a counselor. He transitioned from, as we were growing up, standing behind and letting us go do things. And just like he was with all of you, he stood with you. He didn't stand behind you. And I think that was super impressive. And I would just like to say that the teamwork that our family has shown over the last 2 months was definitely a tribute to what he professed. My dad loved teams. It didn't matter what kind of team, it didn't matter if it was sports, it didn't matter what it was. When he could come together, whether it be the tree cutting team on Chippewa or whatever it was, that was important to him, of connecting people. And so the outreach and the connections that he saw on that Friday night